Times. Should we be viewing today's cut as the committee taking out some insurance against the possibility that the labor market is at risk of weakening? Or is it the committee's view that the dynamics of a downturn are already in place? I guess.
tariffs into inflation has been slower and smaller. The labor market has softened. So the case for there being a persistent inflation outbreak is less. And so that's why we think it's time for us really to acknowledge that the risks to the other mandate have grown and that we should move in the direction of neutral. So what will we do? We'll do what we need to do, but we have two mandates and we try to balance them. For a long time, our framework says that when our two goals are in tension, and this is quite an unusual situation, how do we decide what to do? Because our tools can't do two things at once. What we do is we ask which is farther from, how far is each from the goal and how long is it expected to get to the goal? So, and then we think about those things and we see, as I mentioned, our policy had been really skewed toward inflation for a long time, really. Now we see that there's downside risk clearly in the labor market, and so we're moving in the direction of more neutral policy.
How concerned are you about the slowdown in the jobs market for households at home, especially younger Americans struggling to land a job?
So it's an interesting labor market, and obviously we think it's appropriate that we reduce our rates so that we become more neutral, which presumably will be better for the labor market. You see people who are sort of more at the margins, so kids coming out of college and younger people, minorities are having a hard time finding jobs. The overall job finding rate is very, very low. However, the layoff rate is also very low. So you've got a low firing, low hiring environment, and the concern is that if you start to see layoffs, the people who are laid off there won't be a lot of hiring going on. So that could very quickly flow into higher unemployment. In a healthier economy, healthier labor market, there would be jobs for those people. But now the hiring rate is very, very low. So that's been a growing concern over the last few months. And it's one of the reasons why we think it's appropriate that we begin to shift our policy focus toward a more balanced one.
Steve Leisman, CNBC. Mr. Chair, in the past, during rate cuts, you used the word recalibration. And I wonder if you pointedly did not use it this time. And in fact, when you said policy is not on a preset course, did you mean that as sort of the opposite of recalibration? Are we meeting to meeting, data point by data point? Are we in the process here of getting back to neutral? Thank you.
So I think we're in a meeting by meeting situation. We're going to be looking at the data. Let me say a word about the SEP really here. So we often point this out. What the SEP is it's an accumulation of the individual projections of 19 people, showing what they believe at a particular moment in time to be the most likely path for the economy and thus the appropriate path for monetary policy as well. And as you know, we don't debate or try to agree on what that is. We just write them down and accumulate them. We do sometimes discuss them. And so we always say we're not on a preset path, and we really mean that. The actual decisions we make are going to be based on the incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks at the time the decisions are actually made. So you will have seen that we have 10 participants out of 19 who wrote down 2 or more cuts for the remainder of the year, and 9 who wrote down fewer than, in fact, in a good number of cases, no more cuts. So rather than looking at this as certainty, I would encourage people, as always, to look at the SEP as through the lens of probability. And so there are different possible outcomes and likelihoods rather than this one is certain and this one isn't happening. So that's what I would say.
Thank you for getting to my follow-up question, which was, is the dispersion in the outlook a sign of uncertainty of policy in the meetings to come? Thank you.
It is such an unusual situation. Ordinarily, when the labor market is weak, inflation is low. And when the labor market is really strong, that's when you got to be careful about inflation. So we have a situation where we have two-sided risk. And that means there's no risk-free path. And so it's quite a difficult situation for policymakers. And it's not at all surprising to me that you have a range of views. It's not so much about having different views for the path of the economy, but it's partly that. But it's also partly about what's the right thing to do in light of the tension between the two goals. How do you weight them? How worried are you about one versus the other? And so it's natural. I think it would actually be surprising if you didn't have a pretty wide range of views based, in this kind of highly unusual situation, and we do. So, but, we get together, we discuss, we have a great discussion, and then we decide what to do and we act. But you're right, that it's a wide dispersion of views, and I think that's understandable and natural in the current situation.
Hi, Victoria Guida with Politico. You've talked a lot about Fed independence and the importance of it over the years, but as markets have questions about what exactly President Trump's intentions are with the Fed, what would you point to as the things they should be watching to determine that the Fed is still making decisions based on, the economic outlook rather than political considerations?
Look, it's deeply in our culture to do our work based on the incoming data and never consider anything else. That's just, everybody who's at the Fed really feels strongly about that way. So, you'll know it by the way we talk about what we're doing, by the speeches that people give, by the decisions that we make. You'll know that we're just still going to do that. That's all we do. And we don't frame these questions at all or see them in terms of political outcomes. I think when you get to another part of Washington, everything is seen through the lens of, does it help or hurt this political party, this politician? That's the framework. And I think people find it hard to believe that that is not at all the way we think about things at the Fed. We're taking a longer perspective. We're trying to, serve the American people as best we can. So I think you would be able to tell. I don't believe we'll ever get to that place. I would say we're doing our work exactly as we always have now. And people they're making their arguments, and we're having really a great discussion around these challenging issues. So,
do you see the court case around Lisa Cook as being related to questions of Fed independence?
I see it as a court case that it would be inappropriate for me to comment on.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Edward Lawrence from Fox Business. So we saw the preliminary benchmark revisions down 911,000. The revisions for June were the first negative revisions we've seen since December of 2020. How can the Fed base important decisions on rate and what to do with the interest rates on data that seems to be, as you've called it in the past, noisy?
So on the QCEW, the revision that we saw was almost exactly what we expected. It was amazing how close the expectation was. So, and the reason for that is, for the last bunch of quarters, there's been almost a predictable overcount. And I think the Bureau of Labor Statistics really does understand this, and they're working hard to fix it. It's got to do, of course, it has something to do with low response rates, but it's also got to do with what's called the birth-death model, because a good amount of job creation happens around new companies, and how many go out of business, how many are founded, and it's just really hard. You can't survey for that. You've got to have a model that predicts that, and it's quite difficult to do, especially when the economy is undergoing big changes. So, and they've been working on that and are making progress on it. But the data we get is still good enough for us to do our work. To the extent we have issues around data right now, it's about low response rates. That's happened all over really. Response rates are just lower to surveys now, both in and out of the government. And it's no great secret. We want higher response rates, and we need those to have, less volatile data. And the way to get that is to make sure that the agencies that collect the data have sufficient resources to drive higher response rates. It's not a complicated problem, but that's what it takes. It's not a mystery. That's what it takes. The other thing I'll say, Edward, is in the case of the job creation, the response rate is quite low for the first month, or lower for the first month. By the time you get to the second or third month, you're still collecting responses for that last month, for that prior month, and you get to the place where the data are much more reliable by the second and certainly the third month. So it's not that we don't get the data, it's just that we get it a little later.
But for the benchmarks, if that holds, it's 51% of the jobs that we thought were there weren't really there. Shows a weaker job market coming into this year. If you had had that information, would it have changed your mind related to where the interest rates should be? Should there have been a cut earlier?
We have to live life looking through the windshield rather than the rearview mirror, as you know. And all I can tell you is we see where we are now, and we take appropriate action, and we took that appropriate action today.
Thanks. Howard Schneider with Reuters. So, as you mentioned a minute ago, some margins of the job market would suggest that the slide's already happening. Black unemployment rate in August was above 7%, declining work week, difficulty among college graduates finding work, rising youth unemployment. Why do you think a quarter percentage point now is going to arrest that?
Well, I didn't say that I thought a quarter point would make a huge difference to the economy, but you've got to look at the whole path of rates, right? And the market's has already been baking in expectations. I mean, our market works through expectations, right? So I think our policy path really does matter. And I think it's important that we use our tools to support the labor market when we do see signs like that. I did mention that, you see minority unemployment going up, you see younger people who are more vulnerable economically, more susceptible to economic cycles. That's one of the reasons, in addition to just overall lower payroll job creation, that shows you that at the margin, the labor market is weakening. I would also point to labor force participation. Some part of the significant decline in labor force participation over the last year has probably been cyclical in nature rather than just the usual aging process. So we put all those together, and we see that the labor market is softening, and we don't need it to soften anymore, don't want it to. So we use our tools, and it starts with a 25 basis point rate cut, but the market's also pricing in a rate path. I'm not blessing what the market's doing at all. I'm just saying it's not just one action.
As a follow-up to that, the growth mix right now seems very concentrated in investment and on the consumer spending side in the higher income groups. Do you feel that that's an unsustainable mix for the economy moving forward?
I wouldn't say that. I mean, you're right. Those are two. We're getting unusually large amounts of economic activity through the AI build out and corporate investment. I don't know how long that will go on. No one does. In terms of spending, you saw that the consumer spending numbers were well above expectations, and that may well be skewed toward higher earning consumers. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest that. Nonetheless, it's spending. So, I mean, I think the economy is moving along. Economic growth is going to be 1.5% or better this year, maybe a little better. Forecasts have been coming up, as you can see. So, labor market unemployment is low, but downside risks, but it's still a low unemployment rate. So, that's how we see it.
Hi, Stephanie Rule, MSNBC. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has said that the Federal Reserve suffers from mission creep and institutional bloat. He's now calling for an independent review. Would you support an independent review, or are you open to any sort of reform in any areas of the Fed?
Of course, I'm not going to comment on anything the Secretary says or really any other officer says. So in terms of reform at the Fed, we just went through a lengthy and I think very successful process of updating our monetary policy framework. I would say there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes around the assets we have in the Federal Reserve Federal Reserve system and at the board. Are they the right size? We're actually going through a 10% headcount reduction through the whole Fed, including the board and all the reserve banks. The employment at the Fed at the end of that will be basically at the same level it was more than 10 years ago. So we will have had zero job growth for more than a decade when we're finished with that, and I think we'll probably do more than that. So I think we're certainly open to constructive criticism and ways to do our jobs better.
But not an independent review?
We're certainly open to always trying to do better.
Neil.
Mr. Chairman, Neil Irwin with Axios. There's been some debate lately on whether AI is already starting to affect the labor market in terms of lower labor demand, higher productivity by contrast. Do you buy that? And if that is true, does that have implications for the monetary policy setting?
So there's great uncertainty around that. I think my view, which is also a bit of a guess, but widely shared, I think, is that you are seeing some effects, but it's not the main thing driving it. And so particular focus on young people coming out of college, and yeah, there may be something there. It may be that companies or other institutions that have been hiring younger people right out of college are able to use AI more than they had in the past. That may be part of the story. It's also part of the story, though, that job creation more broadly has slowed down. The economy has slowed down, and so it's probably a number of things. But yeah, it's probably a factor. Hard to say how big it is.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. What evidence do you see of tariffs showing up in inflation?
Well, if you can take goods, just sort of the broad goods category, and last year, goods inflation was negative. If you go back 25 years, that was the typical thing, was that goods inflation was, goods prices generally went down, even adjusting for quality. So that was not the case during the pandemic, of course. Goods inflation went very high, but we had essentially returned to zero or slightly negative inflation. Now, I think goods inflation over the course of the past year is 1.2%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a big change. So we think, I mean, analysts have different views, but we think it's contributing, 0.3 or 0.4 or something like that to the current core PCE inflation reading, which is 2.9%. So it's contributing. What seems to be happening is that, the tariffs are mostly not being paid by exporters, mostly being paid by really the companies that sit between the exporter and the consumer. So if you buy something and you sell it through retail or you use it to make a product, you're probably taking a lot of those costs on and not able to pass it fully along to the consumer yet. That appears to be what we're seeing. All of those companies and entities in the middle, they'll tell you that they have every intention of passing that through in time, but they're not doing that now. To the consumer, the pass-through has been pretty small. It's been slower and smaller than we thought. But the evidence is it's very clear that there's some pass-through.
I also wanted to ask if you could share with us the conditions under which you might consider leaving the Fed in May.
I have nothing new on that for you today.
Hi, Katerina Saraiva with Bloomberg News. I just wanted to follow up on one of your answers just a couple minutes ago. We've often heard you talk about how you and your colleagues, do not think about politics. This does not enter the room. But one of your new colleagues does come from this world, right, where everything is seen through this framework of politics and of what party is being helped, and that person is still employed by the White House. How can markets and the public interpret some of his speeches, for example, and then some of, the forecasts that we see today? I mean, the median for this year was moved because of the introduction of his forecast. I'm talking about the number of rate cuts seen this year. What do you say to markets and the public that are trying to interpret, what you guys are saying?
So there's 12 vote, 19 participants of whom 12 vote, as you know, on a rotating basis. So no one voter, can really, the only way for any voter to really move things around is to be incredibly persuasive. And the only way to do that in the context in which we work is to make really strong arguments based on the data and one's understanding of the economy. That's really all that matters. And that's how it's going to work. And I think that is the way the institution, that's in the DNA of the institution. That's not going to change.
And then I wanted to ask about a Gallup poll that showed that Americans now have more confidence in the president than the Federal Reserve when it comes to doing what's right for the economy. Why do you think that is, and what's your response? What's your message to the public?
Our response is we're going to do everything we can to use our tools to achieve the goals that Congress has given us. and we're not going to get distracted by anything. So I think that's what we're going to do. We're just going to keep doing our jobs.
Claire Jones, Financial Times. Given the range of views expressed prior to the meeting, I think there was a lot less dissent today than a lot of people expected. It'd be good to know just what you think the drivers were of coming to that very strong consensus in the meeting, and also on the flip side to just explain why the dot plots are really so scattered between, someone even expecting rates to end up higher by the end of the year to 5 cuts. I mean, what were the kind of range of views you had about, on one side, why there was so much support for a cut today, and on the flip side, why there's so much divergence about what comes next?
So I think there's quite a wide assessment that the situation has changed with respect to the labor market. Whereas we could still say, and did say in July, at the time of the July meeting, that the labor market was in solid condition, and we could point to 150,000 jobs per month and many other things. I think that the new data that we've had, and it's not just payrolls, it's other things as well, suggests that there really is meaningful downside risk. I said there was downside risk then, but I think that downside risk is now a reality, and there's clearly more downside risk. So I think that's broadly accepted. And so that meant different things for different people. Some wrote down, almost everyone wrote down, supported this cut, and some supported more cuts and some didn't, as you will see from the dot plot. So that's just the way it is. I mean, people have, you have people who take this work very seriously, think about it all the time, do their work, discuss it with our colleagues. We endlessly discuss this between ourselves, and then we have a meeting where we put it all out on the table, and this is what you get. And you're right, there's a range of views in the dots, and I think that's, like I said, very unsurprising given the quite unusual, historically unusual nature of the challenges that we face. But let's remember, though, the unemployment rate's 4.3%. The economy's growing at 1.5%. So it's not a bad economy or anything like that. We've seen much more challenging economic times. But from a policy standpoint, the standpoint of what we're trying to accomplish, it's challenging to know what to do. There are, as I mentioned earlier, there are no risk-free paths now. It's not incredibly obvious what to do. So we have to keep our eye on inflation. At the same time, we cannot ignore and must keep our eye on maximum employment, which is those are our two equal goals. And you will see that there are a range of views on what to do. Nonetheless, we came together today at the meeting and acted with a high degree of unity.
Thank you. Archie Hall from The Economist. You mentioned earlier that job creation was running below your guess at its break-even rate. I'd be curious to hear a bit more about that and where you think the break-even rate is.
So there are many different ways to calculate it, and none of them is perfect. But it's clearly come way down. You could say it's somewhere between 0 and 50,000, and you'd be right or wrong. I mean, there's just many different ways to do it. So wherever it was, 150,000, 200,000 a few months ago, it's come down quite significantly. And that's because a very lower amount of people are joining the labor force. The labor force really not growing much at this point. And that's a lot of where the supply of labor was coming from over the last 2 or 3 years. So we're not getting that now. We've got much lower demand. It's interesting that supply and demand have really come down together so far, except now we do have unemployment ticking up just one tick outside of the range where it's been for a year. 4.3% is still a low level, but I think this speedy decline in both supply and demand has certainly gotten everyone's attention.
Follow up, if I may. You mentioned the downside risk to employment a fair amount, but it's striking that measures of kind of activity and output for the third quarter, those that we have, seem pretty strong. The Atlanta Fed's GDP now is very strong. You mentioned strong PCE numbers as well. How do you square those things? Is there a chance actually could be upside risk to the labor market if those activity measures are right?
Well, that would be great. We'd love that to happen. So I don't know that you see a big tension there, but it's gratifying to see that economic activity is holding in, and it's a good bit from consumption. It looks like consumption was stronger than expected. What we got earlier this week, I guess. And also we're getting a fairly narrow sector is producing a lot of economic activity, which is the AI build out and business investment. So. We watch all of it, and I would say we did move up. The median for growth for this year actually moved up in the SEP between the June and September SEPs. So, and really the inflation and labor market didn't change much. It's really the risks that we're seeing to the labor market that were the focus of today's decision.
Nicole. Hi, Nicole Goodkind with Barron's. Thank you for taking my question. Given the cumulative impact of high interest rates on the housing sector, I'm wondering how concerned you are that current rate levels are exacerbating housing affordability issues and potentially hindering household formation and wealth accumulation for a segment of the population?
Housing is an interest-sensitive activity, so it's at the very center of monetary policy. When the pandemic hit and we cut rates to zero, the housing companies were incredibly grateful, and it was really, they said that was the only thing that kept them going, was that we cut so aggressively and provided credit and things like that, and they were able to finance because we did that. The other side of that is when inflation gets high and we raise rates, and you're right, it does burden the housing industry, and so rates have come down a bit, and as that happens, we don't set mortgage rates, but our policy rate changes do tend to affect mortgage rates, and that has been happening, and that'll of course raise demand. Lower borrowing rates for builders will help, builders will help supply, and so some of that should happen. I think most analysts think that it would have to be pretty big changes for it to matter a lot big changes in rates to matter a lot for the housing sector. And the other thing is by achieving maximum employment and price stability, that's a strong economy, that's a good economy for housing. And then the last thing I'll say is, there's a deeper problem here. There's not a cyclical problem that the Fed can address, and that just is a pretty much nationwide housing shortage. Or a lot of places in the country just don't have enough housing for people, and all of the areas around metropolitan areas like Washington, for example, are very built up, and so you're having to build farther and farther out, and so that's where it is.
And just a quick follow-up. During the last SEP, or the press conference following the last SEP, you seemed to indicate that policymakers lacked conviction about their projections, and I'm wondering if you still feel that way.
Forecasting is very difficult even in placid times, and as I've mentioned before, forecasters are a humble lot with much to be humble about. So I think right now is a particularly challenging time, even more uncertain than usual. And so I don't know any forecaster anywhere, really. Ask any of the forecasters whether they have great confidence in their forecast right now. I think they'll honestly say no.
¿Se me escucha?
Thank you, Chair Powell. Jennifer Schonberger with Yahoo Finance. If you're cutting rates, why continue to reduce the size of your balance sheet, then pause the unwinding?
Well, I think we're cutting the size of our balance sheet quite marginally now. As you know, with the balance sheet, we're still in an abundant reserves condition, and we've said that we would stop somewhat above a somewhat above an ample reserves level. That's what we are, and we're getting closer to that. We're monitoring it very carefully. We don't think that
confirman
that
audio,
has
por favor,
at
si
all
se me escucha.
significant macroeconomic effects. These are
confirman
pretty
en el
small
chat.
numbers moving around inside
Ya
a
me
giant
regresó
economy.
el audio.
The level of
Gracias.
runoff is
Muy bien.
not very large, so I wouldn't
Ahora sí.
attribute macroeconomic consequences to
Vamos a
that at
bajarle
this point.
entonces un poco.
And at his recent confirmation
Volumen
hearing,
aquí.
Stephen Myron brought up that the Fed actually has 3 mandates from Congress,
Como
not
pueden
just
ver,
jobs and stable prices,
pues
but
ya
also moderate long-term interest rates.
tenemos
So what
las
does Congress mean
noticias
by moderate long-term interest rates?
a
How
live.
do we understand that when we see the 10-year Treasury moving? And how
Habíamos
do you think
marcado
about this
una
market
zona
mandate when
de
policy
compra
choices
en
like rate
BTC
cuts
en
and
los
balance sheet reductions affect
$114.200, zona que aún no ha tocado, y con la entrada de volumen que está teniendo en este momento posiblemente no nos toque la entrada. Por eso fue que les mandé a entrar a mercado en el chat de WhatsApp. A ver, vamos a verificar. Me dicen que el chat no está activo. Vamos a ver qué está pasando por aquí. Un segundo. A ver. Me confirman por favor si pueden escribir. Aquí me aparece que sí. Gracias. Ok, mandé a hacer una entrada a mercado en WhatsApp en vista de la entrada de volumen que se estaba viendo. Tenemos un 15M girado al alza y un 30M también, ok, con divergencias alcistas. Recuerden que en horas de la mañana, cuando abrimos el trading room, habíamos explicado de que BTC se encontraba dentro de un rango que se viene formando desde que hubo la ruptura y la compresión en la zona de los 114.519, estructura que rompió con fuerza al alza para posteriormente hacernos este rango, un rango que viene a partir del 11 de septiembre, mientras esperábamos pues los recortes de tasas del día de hoy, que se estima entre unos 25 y unos 50 puntos básicos. Mientras el mercado se mantuvo bastante lateral dentro de esta estructura, donde el mínimo fueron los 114.200, 114.300, y con un fake out que tuvimos la noche de ayer en la zona de los $117.000 para nuevamente volver a ingresar al rango que veníamos teniendo desde ya hace unos días. Ahora pues vamos a esperar, porque en este momento está haciendo un pullback. Vámonos a 15 minutos para que puedan ver con mayor cercanía lo que está haciendo el precio. Vean cómo el precio viene haciendo divergencias alcistas. ¿Bien? En hora de la mañana expliqué que dependiendo de los porcentajes del día de hoy, pues podemos tener un buen repunte al alza. Todos lo estamos esperando, son las expectativas, así como tener un octubre y un noviembre alcista, de acuerdo a los rangos que venimos viendo en años anteriores, que se espera de que el mercado repunte al alza los próximos meses. Y esto pues es una noticia que es sumamente importante para la toma de decisiones tanto de las institucionales como de nosotros los traders para abrir posiciones tanto en largo como en short. Tenemos operativas abiertas en en long desde ayer, desde hace 2 días, por cierto. Vamos a ver. Los que abrieron la posición cuando les mencioné pueden ir resguardándola, pueden ir resguardando posición. Se está quedando sin volumen. Déjenme verificar. En horas de la mañana teníamos una alta... era muy alta la cantidad de longs abiertos. Teníamos aproximadamente 36.000 traders en long contra 17.000 traders en short. El ratio era de más del doble. Por eso es que veíamos una zona de liquidez en la zona de los 114.000, zona que fue a buscar antes del speech de Powell. Vamos a ver, necesito Siguen entrando compras. Necesito abrir mi gráfica de CoinGlass. Recuerden que CoinGlass es totalmente gratuito. Allí pueden obtener mucha información. Quisiera, déjenme ver si me es posible, porque no sé por qué no me abrió. Tratar de recuperar mis pestañas. A ver, un segundo. Historial agrupado. 30 pestañas. Puede ser este que está aquí. Muy bien. Restaurar ventana. Ahora sí, ya se las voy a compartir porque es algo que me parece sumamente importante. Esto lo vimos en hora de la mañana también y pues ya vamos a ver cuánta liquidación hubo dentro del mapa. A ver. Ya se terminó ahí, pues. Vamos a compartirles un segundo. Excelente. Ok. Aquí pueden ver. Esta es la página de CoinGlass, ¿ok? Muy bien. Vamos a verificar el mapa de liquidez a ver cómo quedó. Ahí todavía podemos saber a Bitcoin en la zona de los 115.648. Bien. Vamos a buscar, mi internet o mi transmisión está un poco lenta con respecto a las ventanas que tenemos abiertas. Ok, fíjense qué lindo, ¿no? Esto lo mencionamos en la mañana y lo estuve mencionando incluso con unos usuarios ayer en la noche, donde el precio tenía que venir a buscar la liquidez por la parte baja y sin embargo aún le queda liquidez por la parte baja en la zona de los 114.562 y en la zona de los 113.423. 113.423 y 114.562. Lo verifico aquí en el mapa. Okay. Déjenme les comparto nuevamente lo que es nuestra gráfica para que no pierdan el movimiento. Miren el 15M cómo comienza a confirmar ruptura de las resistencias dinámicas que tenemos en el 15M. Ahí podemos verificar ya. Hemos roto la EMA de 10, la EMA de 21 en el 15M y vamos a ver cómo se comporta en la zona con la EMA de 200 y la EMA de 55, que son las que nosotros usamos por excelencia, ¿ok? Vamos a confirmar si ya tenemos el resultado. Ahí está entrando mucho más volumen, qué lindo. Los que entraron en long, por favor, vayan resguardando la posición. Los que están en el chat de WhatsApp, cuando les avisé que entraran en long, por favor, vayan resguardando posición. Ok. Nosotros mandamos a abrir el long aquí en la EMA de 4 horas, en la EMA de, perdón, en el 1H, en la EMA de 200 mandamos a abrir long. O sea que ya deben ir aproximadamente un 0,92%, dependiendo del apalancamiento con el que abrieron. Pues felicidades, vayan resguardando posición. Vayan resguardando posición, por favor. Excelente, excelente. Cómo va entrando volumen y fíjense cómo aquí en el RSI, perdón, en el ADX comienza a girarse al alza en 1H, en el 30M ya se había girado al alza, que fue cuando les mandé a abrir posiciones. posiciones en long. El 15M tiene muchas divergencias alcistas. Y esta es la zona. Habíamos buscado una zona, una muy buena zona de liquidez en la zona de los 114.316, zona que no llegó, ni siquiera rompió la parte baja del rango, como pueden ver. Increíble, ¿no? Lo que ha hecho BTC el día de hoy, con tan solo una reunión tan esperada como la del día de hoy. Gracias, Yokari, ahí pasando la información también. El chat también, sí, no, el chat está activo. El chat está activo. Todos los usuarios que por favor me están escribiendo en este momento en WhatsApp, vamos a tener un poquito de calma porque no les puedo responder en este momento. Son muchos mensajes ok, estamos en vivo, me es bastante complicado responderles. Lo único que les puedo decir en este momento es resguarden posiciones, ¿ok? El que entró en este soporte dinámico que tenemos aquí en el 4H, en el 1H, que es la EMA de 200, que era una posible primera entrada, por favor, resguarden posición, ¿ok? Resguarden posiciones. Siempre debemos ir un paso adelante al mercado, sobre todo para los que somos scalpers. No sé qué pasa, a ver, déjenme voy a verificar a ver qué es lo que está pasando con el chat, pero veo otras personas que sí están escribiendo. No, bebé 003, ya el loan lo abrimos. Si no estás en nuestro chat de WhatsApp, bebé, ingresa, el mensaje está pineado, yo lo pineé aquí en el chat precisamente para que puedan entrar al chat, porque como no tenía audio, no podía hablar, se me dificultó mencionarles la entrada. Así que váyanse directamente entonces a WhatsApp y ahí van a tener a diario muchísima información importante para tomar las decisiones. Ahora bien, ahí marqué en el 15M, marqué una resistencia bastante fuerte que tenemos en la zona, que es la zona de los 115.958 dólares. Una zona a considerar como un posible pullback, ¿ok? Ahí lo está haciendo, pero en la EMA de 200 en el 15M. Vamos a ver si la fuerza, el volumen, le alcanza para poder romperla con fuerza, que es lo que estamos esperando. Hasta los momentos, fíjense que en temporalidades bajas está empezando a entrarle un poco más de volumen, empieza la DX a tomar fuerza, pero debemos esperar que las próximas temporalidades nos confirme. Hasta el momento la que más nos ha confirmado ha sido el 30M y el 1H aún sigue a la baja, así que vamos a esperar a ver qué pasa. Hola bebé 003, quien nos estaba escribiendo en YouTube, por favor, no ingreses ya el scalping se dio desde la zona que tenemos marcada en el 1H, que es la EMA de 200. Refresquen la página los que no logran escribir. Ok. Muy bien. Necesito verificar aquí un segundo. Vamos a ver si podemos encontrar otras operativas. Vámonos a Solana. No nos tomó la orden, definitivamente Solana no nos tomó la orden. Qué increíble. Mandé a subir la orden de compra en horas de la mañana pensando de que posiblemente pudiésemos haber tenido un mechazo, mucha más volatilidad. No hemos tenido la volatilidad que estamos esperando todavía. Sí dijimos en horas de la mañana que pues este retroceso ya venía por la toma de liquidez que veíamos en la gráfica. Déjenme ver qué les estoy compartiendo. Sí. Y A ver un momento aquí con... Fíjense cómo los loans han bajado muchísimo en comparación con lo que veíamos ayer. A ver, aquí vamos a refrescar esta página. Ok, tenemos 16.881 traders aún en short contra 36.255 traders en long. O sea, todavía sigue siendo altísimo, sigue siendo muy alto. O sea, más del doble de los traders están en long. Pues les está saliendo muy bien ese long, ¿no? Puede que vaya a buscar la zona de liquidez los 116.842. Déjenme lo verifico en el gráfico. 116.842. 116.842 está un poquito... Y ya veo una resistencia fuerte aquí. Claro, no quiere decir que no la vaya a romper. Tenemos 1, 2, 3 toques por la parte alta del rango, lo cual tranquilamente puede venir a romperlo con un poco más de volumen. Verifiquemos el 15M. Quiero abrir posiciones, pero no tengo confirmación aún. No tengo confirmación aún de que el movimiento vaya a ser con una entrada de volumen brusca. Vamos a esperar un segundo. Miren, el trading es tan perfecto. Fíjense en el 4H, como Bitcoin tomó liquidez justamente en la EMA de 55, una EMA que tocó por primera vez desde que tuvimos este cruce el 11 de septiembre. Una EMA que tenía mucha liquidez, 114.731. Teníamos la orden 114.200. 114.265, nos faltó un poquito solamente para tomarla. Tiene mucha absorción por la parte baja de esa vela. Vamos a ver entonces si nos confirma y nos rompe esta resistencia que tenemos en la zona de los 116.095. Vamos a XRP. Esta zona de compra ya no las tomó. Aquí vamos a 3X. Bien. Vamos a ver su 4H. Fíjense que a pesar de todo no tenemos un movimiento tan fuerte. Sigue teniendo un rango. No veo que todavía aún el ADX se posicione como para tener una fuerte subida. La subida que está teniendo pues es por el movimiento que está haciendo BTC. Este 15M sí me gusta un poco más. Este 15M que en horas de la mañana, fue en horas de la mañana que creo que les mencioné que veía muy, pero muy comprimido. Ya ahí está soltando la compresión. Fíjense las EMAs como venían tan juntas, pero estos mechazos los dio durante el discurso de Powell. Vean, las mechas tienen aproximadamente un porcentaje de 2% de movimiento, y desde que hizo este bajo aquí en esta zona, una zona como ven bastante importante donde vino a tomar liquidez, de un 1.72%. Vámonos a Solana. En lo que yo comience a ver una entrada de volumen fuerte, vamos a comenzar a abrir posiciones, pero necesito confirmación. Vamos a ver si las conseguimos durante este live para ustedes. Qué bonito. Esta orden la mandamos a subir un poco, la mandé a subir en horas de la mañana y sin embargo no nos tomó la entrada. Qué mal. Claro, ya te las pasamos, Crush. Ya te vamos a pasar el enlace BB3, BB003. Ahí BB003 está solicitando el enlace en WhatsApp de nuestro live para poderlo compartir con algunos amigos.
Again, we're going to wait and see how things come in December. I mean, it's just, I would put it this way. We're on a path to a more neutral stance.
Déjenme y se lo comparto de una vez. Aquí está el enlace. Ahí te lo compartí en el chat de WhatsApp. El que no esté en nuestro chat de WhatsApp, pueden verificar aquí en este en vivo, en los mensajes pineados del chat. Ahí van a poder encontrar el enlace de nuestro chat. Bien. Vamos a ver aquí. Algo que había yo visto acá en estos días es que tenemos a Form, tenemos a Cava, tenemos a Bake en zonas de sobreventa. ¿Ok? Estas moneditas que están en zona de sobreventa son como que bastante vistosas, por decir así, porque están en mínimos, o sea, son activos que están en mínimos o que han caído mucho y que podemos tomar, dependiendo, claro, hay que verificar siempre el RSI, cómo está y cómo, según la estrategia que ustedes utilicen cada uno para tomar la mejor decisión de compra, pendientes ahí con esos activos. Ok, lo que les mencionaba, septiembre, hasta los momentos, hoy 17, tenemos un 6.35% al alza en Bitcoin. Vamos a ver cómo cierra el mes. Octubre y noviembre por lo general son meses que son alcistas, y si se recuerdan, la última vez que tuvimos un recorte de tasas, que fue en noviembre del año pasado, Bitcoin subió o cerró por encima del 37%. Positivo. O sea que vamos a esperar a ver qué es lo que pasa en las próximas horas. Me comentan ya de la parte de noticias, nuestros reporteros, de que la Fed recorta las tasas a 4 y 4.25%, o sea, 25 puntos básicos. Y mantuvo un compromiso de volver a la inflación al 2%. Para los que, por favor, comparte este enlace, Yokari, aquí en nuestro live, para que los chicos puedan ver la noticia completa, puedan leerla y puedan estudiarla. Eso ya se veía, se tenía previsto que las tasas fuesen de un 25% y no del 50%. Sin embargo, pues, ok, el discurso no fue nada agresivo. Al parecer tiene buena pinta esto, pero hubiese sido mejor un 50 puntos básicos, pero no era viable, sabíamos que no iba a suceder eso. Ok, quisiera buscar operativas para ustedes en vivo, no veo un movimiento fuerte. Ok, aquí tenemos Solana, que ya me empieza a gustar la cosa. Solana podemos abrirle un loncito, pero ya va. Y Solana está de abrir long, ¿ok? El long que no pudimos abrir abajo. Pasa que el 1H de Bitcoin es el que no me da confianza. El 1H de Bitcoin es el que no me da confianza y es este, fíjense, donde este ADX está tomando fuerza a la baja. Y tuvimos un pullback en esta zona de los 115.984. Vean el pullback que hizo, está dejando mucha... Bien, esta vela es la de una hora y le quedan 19 minutos para el cierre de esa vela. Pareciera que va a cerrar, bueno, le quedan 20 minutos aún, pero tiene pinta como de querer cerrar por debajo. Los que estaban en el long, recuerden resguardarla. El 1H de BTC es el que no me está dando confianza, está tomando fuerza. Sin embargo, pues aquí lo que es 15 y 30 no se ven mal, aquí no tiene fuerza. Está perdiendo volumen, definitivamente Bitcoin está perdiendo volumen, pero Solana sí le veo muy bien. Solana puede seguir subiendo. Me gusta su 30M y su 15M, me gustan. Si nos rompe esa resistencia ahí, se va a ir a buscar la zona de los 246. Déjenme ver cuánto mide. Qué bonito que rebotó en la EMA de 200 para subir. Un 2.46%. Vamos, hay que aguantarse un poco. Pero se ve muy bien. Su 4H es alcista, aunque sin fuerza es alcista. 1H alcista, 30, 15 y 5 son alcistas. Hasta el 3M debe tener alcista, sí señor. Se ve muy bonita. Lástima que no vino el mechazo que esperábamos. El mercado reaccionó muy tranquilo. Muy tranquilo. Muy tranquilo para lo que se esperaba. Esperábamos un repunte más fuerte.
Thank you, Chris Rugaber at Associated Press. You mentioned the positive economic data that we've seen since the September meeting, including the revisions to things like savings, higher.
Yo voy a estar atenta. Los que no entraron a nuestro chat, miren XRP. XRP sí está re linda.
Cuts at all in this with this backdrop.
15. Todavía no me da confirmación para entrar. No me da confirmación porque nos puede hacer un pullback, ¿ok? Todavía no. Todavía no. Ok, voy a estar atenta al mercado en las próximas horas para abrir posiciones. Ya vimos que Bitcoin se comportó muy bien. Bitcoin se ha comportado muy bien y pues el repunte que pensamos que iba a tener como tal no tuvo gran movimiento como tal. Voy a chequear Solana y XRP, que son las que estoy viendo que tiene más movimiento. Vamos a verificar por aquí también. A ver cuáles son las que más se están moviendo.
In that process. Overall, as I mentioned, we believe that with an appropriate recalibration of our policy stance, we can maintain strength in the labor market even as our policy stance enables further progress toward our inflation goal.
Great. And just to follow up, could you
tenemos a Alpa, Hoodie, Hi-Fi. A ver, yo tengo Hi-Fi por aquí abierta, pero Hi-Fi tuvo un movimiento de 1000%. Está como complicado. Aunque la zona está hermosa para un long. Okay. A ver, 1H es bastante alcista. ¿Qué está haciendo aquí? Por lo menos en el 30M va a venir a buscar esta zona de los 0.1627. Está bonita Hi-Fi. La zona estaba excelente para abrir un long. Y aquí tiene una resistencia dinámica pendiente de COMO. Pump. Esta de Pump BTC yo quiero buscarle una entrada también. Vamos a verificar esto. Y buscamos confirmación. Un segundo.
Much like an airplane reaching the airport slows down. And so
4 horas alcista. 1H tiene una divergencia a la baja. No me gusta. Aparte de que tiene un ranguito aquí que hay que esperar mucha, pero mucha compresión en la zona. Ok, muchachos, para los que no han ingresado todavía a nuestro chat de WhatsApp, el enlace está en este chat de aquí, de este live en YouTube, donde pueden adquirir el enlace para ingresar a nuestro chat. Y constantemente nosotros estamos pasando análisis, señales, incluso para que puedan guiarse y entrar a nuestro canal de señales gratis, ¿ok? Por ahora los voy a dejar hasta que yo consiga una entrada de liquidez bastante fuerte, una entrada de volumen fuerte en algún activo para abrir posiciones, porque realmente el mercado de las alts como tal no se movió. Incluso BTC no tuvo el repunte que estábamos buscando. Ok, muchachos, se les quiere, cuídense, saludos, bye bye.
So that's why forecasts generally see a couple of upticks toward the end of the year. On the other hand,